When messages arrive, they reply, sometimes warmly, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes with more care than they realize. But the act of initiating, that first tap, that first line, often doesn't happen. Not out of disinterest, not out of arrogance, not because people don't matter. It simply doesn't surface in the mind as a need. For many people like this, conversation is not something the mind actively seeks to start. It is something the mind responds to when it appears. When no message arrives, nothing feels incomplete. There's no internal alarm saying, I should talk to someone right now. The inner world feels occupied, not loud, not chaotic, just full. Thoughts drift. Ideas loop gently. Observations stack on top of one another without urgency. Time passes differently there. Hours can move without the sense that anything is missing. And when someone later asks, why didn't you text first? The question can feel strangely hard to answer, because there was no clear reason, only the absence of a signal. Inside this state, the mind is not scanning for social engagement. It is not checking emotional temperature. It is not counting how long it has been since the last interaction. It is resting in its own current. This doesn't mean the person doesn't care. Often, they care deeply. They remember details others forget. They notice tone shifts, pauses, small inconsistencies. They think about conversations long after they end. But caring does not automatically translate into initiating contact. The internal mechanism is different. For some, conversation begins with a feeling of need. For others, it begins with a feeling of response. When there is no external pull, the system stays still. There is also something else present beneath this pattern. A quiet awareness that what occupies their mind doesn't always translate well into casual conversation. They may think about things that feel hard to bring up, questions without clean answers, observations that feel too abstract, too slow, or too disconnected from everyday exchange. So when free time appears, it doesn't automatically turn into, I should talk to someone. It turns into staying where the mind already is. There is often a mild sense of apology tied to this. Not dramatic guilt, not panic, just a low-grade awareness that others might interpret the silence differently, that someone might think they are distant, or indifferent, or withholding. They may even rehearse explanations internally, not to send, but just to understand themselves. I wasn't ignoring anyone. I didn't forget. I just didn't feel the moment to start. But explanations stay internal because sending them would require initiating, and that same barrier remains. When conversations do happen, these individuals often show up fully. They listen, they engage, they stay present longer than expected, which can create a confusing contrast for others. How can someone be so attentive, yet so absent? From the inside, it doesn't feel contradictory. Presence is easy when there is a shared space already open. Opening the space is the part that doesn't activate naturally. This is not a strategic choice. It's not calculated distance. It's closer to how some people relate to time. They don't feel pressure from empty moments. Silence doesn't register as a problem to solve. If no one is speaking, the world still feels complete. There can also be a subtle resistance to interruption, not in a defensive way, more like a preference for continuity. The mind settles into a rhythm, and breaking it requires a reason strong enough to surface above that rhythm. Casual check-ins don't always rise to that level. Later, when they realize how long it's been, the awareness arrives softly. Oh, it's been a while, not followed by panic, not followed by urgency, just recognition, sometimes paired with a quiet sadness, not about the distance itself, but about how easily it happens without intention. They may wonder why connection doesn't pull them outward the way it seems to for others, why free time doesn't create social hunger, why care exists without momentum. There is often a misunderstanding that people who don't text first are withholding effort from the inside. It doesn't feel like withholding. It feels like being complete in the absence of stimulation. The mind is not empty. It is occupied with things that don't demand witnesses. This can be hard to articulate, especially in a culture where visibility equals care. where initiating contact is treated as proof. For people in this state, care is not loud. It does not announce itself. It sits quietly, often unnoticed, even by the person carrying it. And when someone finally does reach out, it can feel grounding, not relieving tension, but aligning two worlds, as if the external world has gently tapped the internal one, and both are allowed to coexist for a while. There is no sense of finally, only now. This pattern doesn't come from a lack of warmth. It comes from a different relationship with internal motion. Some minds move outward, others settle inward. Neither is a statement, neither is a message. It's simply how attention organizes itself. And for those who recognize this pattern in themselves, there is often a quiet relief in naming it, without turning it into a flaw. Not something to fix, not something to justify, just something that exists. A way of being where silence is not empty, and presence does not require constant initiation. Over time, this pattern can quietly shape how someone is perceived. From the outside, gaps get filled with assumptions. Silence becomes interpreted. Absence starts to mean something it was never meant to mean. But from the inside, there is no narrative playing, no internal story of withdrawal, no statement being made, just a mind that remains where it already is. Many people like this don't experience free time as an open window that needs to be filled. They experience it as a continuation. Thoughts continue, attention continues. The internal atmosphere stays stable. There is no sensation of nothing is happening. So when hours pass without reaching out, it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like time doing what time does. Sometimes they notice others checking in frequently, asking how things are, sending small updates, jokes, fragments of their day. These gestures are recognized as care, but they don't automatically trigger imitation. Not because those gestures are unwanted, but because they don't naturally arise from the same internal place. For some people, connection begins externally and moves inward. For others, it begins inward and stays there unless something pulls it out. This difference is subtle, but it shapes everything. It can create moments of confusion when someone says, "I thought you didn't want to talk," and the response feels inadequate, no matter how it's phrased, because wanting is not the right word. There is interest, there is affection, there is concern. They just don't translate into impulses. Often, there's also an awareness, quiet, persistent, that their inner focus doesn't always match what others expect. They may care about things that don't fit into short exchanges. They may think in layers, not updates. They may feel that saying nothing is more honest than saying something small that doesn't represent what's actually going on. So they wait, not consciously, not deliberately. They wait because the moment to speak hasn't formed clearly enough to move them. And when it does, when something finally crystallizes into words, it can feel meaningful. But that threshold is higher, not because they are guarded, because they are precise with attention. There is also a particular kind of tiredness that comes from trying to perform a rhythm that doesn't match your own. Initiating conversation on a schedule, checking in because it's expected, sending messages that feel disconnected from the internal state. This can create a subtle friction, not dramatic exhaustion, just a sense of misalignment. So, without consciously deciding to stop, they often don't start. Later, they might notice patterns. People who eventually stop reaching out, chats that go quiet without confrontation, connections that fade without conflict. These moments can sting, not sharply, but deeply, because from their perspective, nothing changed. Care didn't diminish, interest didn't fade. Only the outward motion was never there to begin with. There can be a quiet grief in that realization, not grief over loss exactly, but over mismatch. A sense that internal presence isn't always visible enough to survive on its own. Still, even in that grief, there is rarely an impulse to chase, not because they don't value the connection, but because chasing feels foreign. The internal world doesn't know how to generate urgency on command, and urgency feels like distortion. So instead, they accept the quiet, not proudly, not defensively, just realistically. They may tell themselves, without words, "This is how it goes," not as resignation, more as acknowledgement. In moments of reflection, they might notice how often their attention goes toward things others rarely ask about. Ideas, patterns, questions without practical use. They may care deeply about meaning, coherence, internal consistency, things that don't easily convert into messages that start with "hey," so they stay with those things. And the absence of outward motion continues, not because people don't matter, but because the inner landscape is already occupied. It's also worth noting how calm this state can feel. There is little anxiety around response time, little pressure to maintain visibility. Silence doesn't register as danger. This calm is often misunderstood as detachment, but detachment usually carries distance. This carries immersion in one's own mental space. And when someone does enter that space, by reaching out, by asking, by showing up, it is often welcomed without hesitation. The door was never locked. It just wasn't being advertised. For those who live this way, there is often a quiet relief in realizing they are not broken, that this isn't avoidance disguised as personality, not emotional unavailability hiding behind habit. It is simply a different relationship with initiation, a different trigger system, a different pace. And recognizing that can soften a lot of internal pressure. The pressure to explain, the pressure to compensate, the pressure to perform presence in a way that doesn't feel natural. This recognition doesn't change behavior. It doesn't solve misunderstandings, but it does something else. It removes self-blame. It allows the silence to exist without being immediately turned into a flaw. It allows the mind to stay where it is, without needing to justify that choice. And perhaps most importantly, it reframes the quiet, not as absence, but as fullness that doesn't announce itself. There is nothing to fix here, nothing missing that needs to be added, just a pattern that makes sense once it's seen clearly. And for now, that understanding can be enough, not to move forward, not to do anything differently, just to rest in the recognition that this way of being is coherent, and that you don't need to force motion into a mind that is already still.